We're joined here today by David Friedfel. David is the Director of State Studies with the Citizens Budget Committee, a commission of New York State, a very important entity in New York. David, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me. It's great to be here.
Can you tell us, David, a little bit about the commission, its purpose, your job there? You have a long history. You worked in county government for a while for Albany County as the Director of Management and Budget. You've worked in state government in the New York State Legislature, very familiar with taxation issues. Tell us a little bit about the commission.
Sure. So the commission was founded in 1932, so we have a very long history. Originally, it was created as a way for citizens to really kind of study and understand what was going on in New York City government, and also to make important recommendations and kind of be a guiding force for the city's budget making. Since then, in the 1980s, they expanded to state government and also to the New York State Metropolitan Transportation Authority and also the New York, New Jersey Port Authority. So we're a nonpartisan fiscal watchdog group. We're a nonprofit, and we really try to focus on improving the way that government functions to make sure that taxpayer dollars are being spent effectively. We're a small group, so to do that, we focus in on a few specific areas, particularly areas of taxation we look at, but more so education, aid, where that goes, transportation, infrastructure, debt, and also how employees are compensated, particularly pensions and retirement, and we do a lot of comparison and contrast as well.
Seems to be that lost connection to government, the citizens. So very important component. After all, that's who the government officials work for. The governor, the state legislature, the members of Congress, the president of the United States, they all are put in those jobs by the citizens.
Exactly, and we try to really focus on the way that services can be improved, and the way that that finances can really be utilized in a way that improves the daily functioning of New York citizens, and also to make sure that people are being treated fairly. So we're not out to get anybody. We're not kind of one of the gotcha groups that goes out and tries to find the wasted $50,000. We like to talk about programs and overall ways of changing things, and kind of some of the stuff that ends up going under the radar because it's so big, it's almost automatically accepted. And we try to look at those things with a new set of eyes.
Well, when we're talking about, and we are talking about, $150 billion state budget, having someone like you who's truly independent and not a political person by any means, an independent voice or an analysis, if you will, on these some $150 billion of our money. These are the citizens' taxes, after all, that we're talking about here. Let's talk for a minute about that state budget. What is going on? The state is coming into its last quarter. It operates, the state fiscal year will end at the end of March of 2018. Can you talk a little bit about, from your perspective, how the state will close its current fiscal year?
So the last almost 2 years, the state has continually had to lower its personal income tax forecast. So the state updates its financial plan once a quarter. It gets updated when the executive budget's released, and then at an enacted budget, then there's a mid-year. So it gets adopted. It gets revised, about 4 times a year. And almost every single time for the last 2 years, they've had to lower their personal income tax forecast.
What does that mean when we're lowering personal income tax forecasts? For our viewers here now, does that mean that we're not making the income and therefore we're not paying taxes to the state?
To a large extent, it does. The best way to think of it, I think, is that you expect, pretend the government is like a household, and you expect to make $100,000 that year, so you're expecting to have a good year, and continually you actually end up bringing a bit less than that, so you end up only making $95,000. Now, it doesn't sound like a big deal, but for a state government, that money is lined up almost exactly with what spending's supposed to be. So that means that on the other side, on the spending side, they then have to decrease how much they're spending. Now, the governor has a lot of control over state operating spending. Local aid is pretty much dictated by what the legislature adopts. The governor doesn't really have much control over that. But as far as other areas of spending, agency spending, Medicaid spending, things like that, the governor does have some ability to hold that back, and that's what the governor's been doing for the last year and a half almost. And that's so the question has arisen whether or not the legislature is going to have to come back, something that we've talked about. And the governor has a lot of control over the budget, so hopefully that won't have to happen. It may. The governor could call them back. It's something he's done in the past. It's not something I've heard rumors about recently. So with any luck, things will be able to kind of plug along, and the governor will be able to keep those things going. The legislature also comes back in January. The State of the State's scheduled for January 3rd, so the legislature will be in session then. So even if changes do need to be made, if you can wait till then there's no need for a special session.
So we've heard David, when we're talking with David Friedfel, the Director of State Studies from the Citizens Budget Commission. We're very grateful that you're here to talk with us here today. We've heard reports recently about a gap, meaning that the revenues that we've been talking about here don't match the expenditures of state government, this $150-some-odd billion budget, which the state of New York, home to nearly 20 million of us that are in this great state, a population that's somewhat fragile. Our census count continues to go down over the 10-year count, which the federal government tracks the amount of people that live in the states. What is it about this gap that concerns you as an analysis, and where do you think it's going as we go into next year's state budget?
Well, one of the biggest concerns is that we end up running substantial and recurring deficits. If you have a one-year deficit because of a specific issue, then you can kind of make that back in the next year. You can adjust spending. You could increase taxes. There are lots of things you can do to kind of take care of that one-time issue. You can go into your reserves. That's kind of what reserves are really for. So every year, the state has its budget, it has how much it's going to take in, it has how much it's going to spend, and then it has a little bit to the side, kind of your household savings, if you will. And if something bad happens, then you can use that savings, and I think everyone's kind of generally okay with that. You understand that if there's a economic recession, or if a federal statute changes and the state's no longer being reimbursed the way they expect it to, that you can dip into that reserves, and then you'll slowly rebuild it back up. Where you get into trouble is when you end up using one-shots, is something that we call, where you have something is a one-time revenue, and then you use that to create an ongoing program. And that's a real problem, because then next year the revenue's not there, but people still expect the spending to happen. So that's one of the concerns that we have with a deficit. This year, according to the Division of Budget, and they're usually pretty good about these things, the revenue is coming in less than they expected, so they're going to try and they're calling back spending. They're gonna try and make things work with what they have for this year. Next year's budget picture is looking a bit worse. Going forward, as I said, the state has continually had to lower their personal income tax forecasts. Going forward to next year, it looks like they're going to have to do that yet again. They're kind of relying on an upswing for the last quarter of the year, where there'll be an increase in revenues over the prior years, and that's concerning, because if that doesn't come in, then the picture will look even worse going into to close out the year and then into next year as well.
So we have basically two choices: we either cut spending or raise taxes.
Yeah.
And this is the decision that the governor will have to make. He proposes the budget to the legislature, then the state legislature, which is representative of the citizens themselves, comes together and actually has to appropriate what the governor is recommending. Let's talk about the role of the federal cuts. The federal government has a role, if you will. We have the local governments, which the counties of New York are very connected to these federal programs in New York State. Unlike most states across the country, New York's counties are mandated to provide much of the health and human services programs which the states provide in other states. But what is the role of the federal government with the state deficit that we've talked about here, and the state spending and the programs and services? Maybe you could talk for a little bit about federal cuts that might be out there, but also talk, if you would, just for a few minutes about the federal tax reform that's being discussed, and are they related?
Sure. So why don't we start with the federal tax reform? So the current deficits that we talked about before, where you could expect anywhere in a deficit from a range of 4.4 billion, even up to 6.3 billion, depending on whose numbers you're relying on. The federal tax changes have no impact on that, because those numbers were released and that analysis was done before there was a federal tax package. Now, that being said, there is really no expectation that the changes in the federal tax package will have a significant direct impact on New York State revenues. Where we're concerned, and where everyone should be concerned, is that as taxes go up, people with means frequently will leave. They'll go to a place that the taxes are much lower. Now, with the limitation that is on state and local tax state and local taxes, there's a real concern that as wealthy New Yorkers can no longer deduct their local taxes, and New York does have high local taxes, that those individuals will decide to change their formal domicile. So many people, many wealthy people especially, I'm not one of them, have homes in multiple states. They'll have a house in Florida, a house in New York, and they go down to Florida when it gets cold. They go down for a few months a year. Florida has no personal income tax. So those individuals may now choose, you know what, now it makes sense for me to stay in Florida for 6 months and 1 day, and that's enough so that they don't have to pay New York State personal income tax on anything other than direct wages that they receive in New York. So all of their capital gains will no longer be taxed. And while
That's very important for New York because New York relies on its population to fund small businesses. People's lives are at stake here. Property taxes fund school district operations and local government functions, our roads, bridges, public safety. This is very important for a state like New York.
It is, and one of the reasons why it's really important is because New York actually relies on 1% of taxpayers, the wealthiest 1%, to provide 40% of personal income tax.
That's nearly half of the revenues funding the state budget.
Correct, come from personal income tax, and 40% of that comes from 1% of the population, which is concerning for multiple reasons in every year, one of them being that those incomes, particularly capital gains, they vary a lot from year to year. The stock market goes up, the stock market goes down. It's not uncommon to see capital gains go up 30, 40, 50% in 1 year and then drop by the same amount a couple years later.
Why does the governor call this issue an economic civil war? He has recently made that statement. Those are pretty strong words to use in this context. Well, what does he mean by that?
You'd have to ask the governor that one. I'm not really sure exactly on kind of the governor's verbiage there.
Does he feel that it's disproportionately affecting this state and that the other states are ganging up, if you will, on a state like New York through economic measures?
I think he does, and I think that there's a certain level of accuracy there. And I don't study the federal government very much. You know, I understand the impacts on the state, so kind of the politics there are not something I'm certainly an expert on. But clearly this will have a disproportionate impact on New York State and California and other high-tax states, in so much that suddenly where you could deduct your state and local taxes from your federal taxes, so instead of paying the full, say 8.82% is the top rate right now, it would actually only cost you in the area of, let's say, 6%, because you could deduct that cost from your federal taxes. So it wasn't as bad. It wasn't as big of a hit. When you cap that deduction, suddenly you're paying the full 8.82% instead of the 6% or so. So your state taxes went up by 30%, and people take action then. And that'll have an impact because they'll leave and all the things you said.
David, let's talk for a minute about the cuts. We've talked about the tax policies. One cut that has been coming into focus and discussed quite a bit, which affects New York City and the rest of New York State as well, is a program that helps about 300,000 children. Child health insurance program. It's called CHIP. This is something the federal government has been funding New York State, and I believe it's around $1 billion with a B. Now let's talk about, is the state in a position to absorb a $1 billion funding cut as we go into the next state fiscal year?
Absent some tax increases, it's not. But in the same sense, I don't envision the state legislature or the governor or most people in New York State to be okay with 300,000 kids getting kicked off of health insurance. I mean, it's a significant issue. One of the benefits is the way the program is funded at the federal level is there's a bit of a delay. So as some states are actually starting to, they've already sent out letters in certain states saying your child may not have health coverage next month because you have to provide, I believe it's 30 days worth of notice. New York is not in that place yet. They still have enough money left over from the prior year that they're going to be able to carry through. It looks like for another couple of months based on the latest figures I've seen. So New York has a little bit of time there, but if the program is not renewed, that's $1 billion cut to the state. And then on top of that, you also have other cuts to the essential health plan. So the state has an essential health plan. They took an option under Obamacare, and they provide health insurance to I think it's hundreds of thousands of New Yorkers. The number escapes me right now. And if that is cut, that could also put another close to $1 billion onto the state's rolls as well, because many of the people covered under that plan, due to a court ruling in New York State, would be forced onto Medicaid, where the state has a 50% share, as you know.
So the counties, the local governments are mandated right now to keep those property taxes at 2%. We can't raise these taxes, and we haven't been raising property taxes above this 2% property tax cap that's mandated by the state. The state of New York also has something similar in it, a 2% spending cap. A little difference. One's a revenue cap that the local governments use to fund programs, but one is a discretionary spending cap. The state has talked about keeping its expenses under 2%. When we look at a program like that with a loss of $1 billion, and we look at the gaps that you've talked about in the out years here, $4 billion going into next year, how does this 2% spending cap factor in? Is it a real thing? How is that a factor as we talk about these issues?
Well, it largely is a real thing from an accounting standpoint. So the governor proposes a state operating spending, which is kind of one definition of state spending. So that spending measure is about $100 billion out of the $150 billion budget. So there's some things that are outside of that, a lot of things that are outside of that, including capital spending as well as federal spending, essentially, that flows through the state. So this is all of the things that the state has options on to a large extent. And it's 2%. But the governor in recent years and going back a bit has kind of has made some maneuvers, we'll say, where he will move money from one year to another so the state can prepay its debt. Now, prepaying debt sounds like a good thing. Usually, if you're a homeowner, let's say, and you pay your mortgage a little early, you save some money. That's not really what's happening. It's more like if your credit card payment's due on April 3rd and you pay it on March 29th, you don't save any money because you're just paying the bill a few days early. And that's largely what the governor's been doing in paying debt service in March instead of April. And that kind of increases spending in the prior year, so it lowers the growth rate for the future year. He's also moved a lot of money out of state operating spending. Some money they've moved into capital, so there's some personnel expenses that they've moved from the general fund into the capital funds. These are folks who work on capital projects. It's kind of not an accounting move that I would necessarily use, but if you're going to do things like that, you should kind of make that adjustment in both years when you're talking about growth rates so that things don't get confused. And they haven't been doing that. And that's a concern for us. And the other thing they've done, which a lot of homeowners, or new homeowners especially, are aware of, is that they've changed the STAR benefit. So new enrollees in STAR, they actually get a check back from the state instead of getting a discount on their property tax bill originally. And they actually call that a personal income tax credit. So what happens is it impacts the revenue side and not the spending side. So instead of, so basically that money comes out of that 2% calculation, and it makes it so that the governor is able to say 2%, and not, from an accountant standpoint, it is 2%. But if you kind of add those things back in, this past year's budget actually grew closer to 3.7%. And all those federal changes would have to go into that state operating spending number, though, so they'd have to be adjusted. And if you want to say that state operating spending stayed at 2% except for these things, and we had to add those back in because we wanted to pay for them, I think that that's fair. But that's not exactly what the governor's been doing.
We're talking with David Friedfel. David is the Director of State Studies for the Citizens Budget Commission. And let me say, David, I sure am glad that you're there. We're talking about some pretty complicated tax-related issues, economic forecasting, very complicated stuff, but yet very important for our viewers, very important for the people of New York State. After all, this is our money, our taxation that's going to fund important programs, health programs, infrastructure programs, public safety initiatives. Let's talk in just the minute or so that we have left here about debt.
Sure.
And the comptroller talking about debt. Why should our viewers and the people of New York State care that over $3,000 per person in the state of New York is attributed to debt? What is debt? How does the state contract debt or use that credit card? And how much of that $60 billion or so is voter approved?
A very small portion. I think it's in the range of about $4 to $5 billion was actually voter approved, and the state constitution.
That's a very small amount.
It is, and the state constitution calls for voter approval of all general obligation debt.
So how is this debt being issued if the Constitution requires the voters to have a say?
Well, it's commonly referred to as backdoor borrowing. So the state's public authorities are authorized to issue debt for their purposes. And that was kind of the original intention, I believe. And instead it's kind of warped into where they will issue debt now for state purposes. The dormitory authority is one of the biggest ones.
And what is the role of the state comptroller in the issuance of this debt?
The
Is
state,
she approving it, or is it just being done by the agencies?
I believe it's being done just by the authorities. I mean, the state comptroller is involved and certainly aware, based on his report, of what's going on, and is calculating all of these things. But it's not through the normal process. It's not through the process that was originally set up in the Constitution.
Why should New Yorkers care about the amount of debt the state issues?
Because New Yorkers are going to have to pay it back. As long as they're still in New York, at some point they're going to have to pay it back. And one of the things that we find particularly problematic about the high level of debt is that it's not all being done for infrastructure. Some of the debt is being issued for really programmatic type spending. And that's really a cause for concern, because you're really kicking the can down the road. Now, if you have a 30-year bridge, the bridge is supposed to last 30 years, I think it's kind of commonly accepted that maybe you can issue a 30-year bond to cover that, so that everyone who uses it is going to be paying it back, and you'd have tolls to pay it back. And that makes sense. But issuing debt for other purposes is a little problematic. And one of the things that the comptroller didn't include in his report was actually the amount of money that the state owes for retiree health care. That's currently estimated in the range of $80 billion. So it's much more than the 3,000. So you add that on, you're in the range of almost $7,000 per New York State resident that's basically being put on the credit card.
And how does that compare with other states?
We're by far the highest. By far per capita.
Per capita.
Yeah.
We should be concerned then that if you look at the 3,000, or as you mentioned, the 7,000 or 8,000 per person, if you include retiree health insurance, that's way above the national average.
It is. The one thing that kind of gives us a little bit of calm is that as far as the state's retirement system, we're very close to fully funded, and certainly compared to other states, we're doing a much better job on that. It's the retiree health insurance that's really a concern, and then just general debt that's been issued for infrastructure and then for other purposes as well.
David, let's have you wrap up this segment here about the state budget, sort of what you see going forward. This is the 2018-2019 state budget. We'll hear from our governor in the next few weeks. He'll present a plan to the state legislature from the Citizens Budget Commission, from the chair of the Director of State Studies, David Friedfel. What do you see as you look into the state budget?
Well, there are a number of things that we're looking at. We actually put out a piece today on the kind of what to look for. It's something we do before every state budget and New York City budget as well. So amongst the things we're looking for is really, how is the governor going to close this gap? Because it is a real gap. It's anywhere between $4 and $6 billion, and even if you include the savings from keeping spending under 2%, you're still in the range of close to $2 billion in real substantive cuts that are going to have to happen at the state level. So in looking at that, we've been looking at the property tax relief rebates that the state started a couple years ago. That's $1 billion right there that's going to be going out. Middle income tax cuts are supposed to go into effect January 1st at the state level. I don't know if that's kind of gotten lost in much of the conversation about in Washington, but that's also going to reduce revenues by about $1 billion next year. So that's something that we're looking at. And then there's federal changes. The Child Health Plus program, as well as the Essential Plan, are significant. And then there's another program. It's called supplemental payments. It's kind of a collection of 3 or 4 different programs that give money to hospitals that serve people who are uninsured or underinsured, who don't pay the the other part of their bill. And that money it's about $5 billion altogether that gets spread around the state. And we've looked at that in the past, and we have some recommendations for ways to improve that to make sure that it's going to the places that it really should go. So that's just a handful of the things that we'll be looking at. And it's going to be an interesting budget year. So we'll be looking at that, and also a couple years ago, the governor actually proposed kind of rolling back the takeover of the local Medicaid share specific to New York City. So that's something that we'll definitely be looking for and advocating against if it's something that is proposed.
David, on behalf of the citizens of New York, thank you.
Oh, thank you
for doing your job and helping to inform us as citizens, and also the members of the state legislature and the governor on the impact of the state budget and other tax and finance issues. David Friedfel, thank you.
Thank you.